the invasion of Russia.
Yeah, they told us this wasn't going to happen. They told us this wasn't going to happen. There wasn't going to be cross-border incursions with U.S. weaponry from Ukraine into Russia. But like everything else, like every other red line that's been crossed, this one, you can check this one off the list too.
Yeah. Well, let's start this segment on a cross-border raid in Russia by showing you how the Financial Times, I think, factually reported it, and how this differed from a lot of the spin from U.S. media, which attempted to portray this as some kind of Russian civil war. Here's the Financial Times. Militias used U.S. armored vehicles in attack over Russian border. Far-right militias who stormed a Russian region bordering Ukraine this week used U.S.-made tactical vehicles in the attack, raising questions over Kyiv's support for Ukraine-based Russian extremist groups. Ukraine has denied direct involvement in the raid on Monday, but one military official acknowledged cooperating with the nationalist groups who on Monday entered Russian territory to liberate a village. And the head of this Russian volunteer corps, we'll show some photos of them a little later, told the Financial Times that his fighters assaulting the Belgorod region, the border region in Russia, were in possession of American-made vehicles. These included at least two M1224 Max Pro armored vehicles. Those are the MRAPs that you commonly see in U.S. convoys, and several Humvees, he said, while declining to disclose how they were obtained. And these images were all over the place. For that piece, by the way, was authored by Christopher Miller, who used to be at the U.S. government publication Radio Free Liberty, Radio Europe. It's interesting how they feed them into international publications that are supposedly independent of government influence. And he referred to the Russian Volunteer Corps as far-right fighters, but this is actually a banned group inside Russia that is neo-Nazi. And these are neo-Nazi organization. This is a neo-Nazi organization. And one of the leaders of this group was asked about being a neo-Nazi by the international press. After this failed border raid, we should point out that it was a completely failed raid in which everyone involved was either captured or killed or forced to flee. And here he's asked about it.
Do you describe yourself as a neo-Nazi? Do you mind being described as a neo-Nazi?
I don't think it's an insult. I don't care about that. I mean, what can I do about it?
Do you mind being described as a neo-Nazi?
Media, so you can call me pedophile. You can call me neo-Nazi. You can call me whatever you want. What can I do against it?
You can call me a pedophile. You can call me a neo-Nazi. You can call me whatever you want. Well, you can see that flag behind him is a ultra-nationalist or neo-Nazi flag. And many of the figures involved in the leadership of this organization were in neo-Nazi circles in Russia before they got weaponized by the Ukrainian military to carry out these kind of attacks, which clearly, in my view, and in the view of so many others who are observing this closely, was partly designed to distract from the catastrophic Ukrainian defeat in Bakhmut, which Zelensky had described before U.S. Congress as Ukraine's Battle of Saratoga. So, and it successfully did that in some senses. The U.S. media was turned its attention to this. But then we have the issue of U.S. weapons going to neo-Nazi groups backed by the Ukrainian military, as Financial Times acknowledged, Aaron.
Yeah, and let me show you how the New York Times reported this. They pointed out this about the raid. They said, already the Kremlin has said that the raiders abandoned American-made military vehicles inside Russia, and Moscow can use the far-right histories of some of the raiders to bolster its largely false claim to be fighting Nazis in Ukraine. I had never seen this verbiage before. So before I was told that Russia's claim to be fighting Nazis is false, right? It's Russian propaganda. Now, according to the Times, it's largely false. So the question becomes, like, how large is that falsehood, and what part of the claim to be fighting Nazis is true? Like, can we get a percentage from the New York Times? I think that would be helpful, because how can something be largely false? It's a strange way to put it.
Largely false, but there's some truth to it. We just won't say how much truth there is, but it's more false than true.
More false than true, right? Sure, yeah. So there's more people inside. Basically, there's more people inside Ukraine who are not Nazis than are Nazis. Fair enough, and that's what we've always said. But the point is, there are Nazis, and they do have major influence, and they do carry out operations like this. And it's just interesting that this is how the New York Times copes with that.
Well, here's some more of the largely non-Nazi Russian volunteer corps. This is just a look at who they are.
Представители околофутбольных фирм и ультрас всегда были движущей силой протестных и
Does this look like,
революционных процессов в МИД. К сожалению, не всегда
are they
эти усилия
just
имели
far
результат.
right or
Но сейчас нам выпал реальный шанс изменить будущее России. И этот шанс последний. Потому что победа Российской Федерации в этой войне будет означать торжество преступного режима и гибель русского народа. Мы на своей земле, в своем родном городе. Мы здесь, чтобы спасти
so? I mean, you have guys that look like
который ведет к вымиранию русской нации. А повсеместной коррупции, которая с каждым днем
the Russian version of Al Qaeda or ISIS, talking about carrying out regime change in Russia, attacking their own government, and a separatist project, and they're waving the flag of football ultras. In other words, they're football hooligans. They're saying that we draw from the ranks of football hooligans to fill the Russian volunteer corps. And this is who is getting U.S. weapons. I mean, we're not talking just about small arms. We're talking about heavy weapons, MRAPs, Humvees. They're getting them from the Ukrainian military. And Denis Nikitin, who is the leader of the Russian volunteer corps, told the Financial Times, well, he refused to tell the Financial Times how he got those weapons. But it's the same thing we saw on the Syrian battlefield, where the FSA, this fake moderate rebel group, was created by the CIA with supposedly moderate leadership who had supposedly been trained in moderation to take over and cause a democratic transition. And they all just became a weapons farm for Al Qaeda and ISIS. And we eventually saw Jabhat al-Nusra carrying US TOW missiles, BGM TOW missiles built by Raytheon into the field. We saw it again and again and again, and US media always would show the pictures, but they didn't seem troubled by the fact that the organization responsible for 9/11 was being armed by the US. And it's the same with these neo-Nazis. Joe Biden at Howard University's commencement address, the most prestigious historically Black college in the US, declared white supremacy to be the #1 terror threat in the United States. And here we are providing neo-Nazis with not just TOW missiles or small arms, but MRAPs, Humvees.
Yeah. And going back to Syria for a second, one of the reasons why the U.S. Classified its program in Syria as covert is, in the words of one Obama administration official, a senior administration official, this is from the New York Times, quote, "We needed plausible deniability in case the arms got into the hands of al-Nusra." So one of the major reasons for the secrecy was that they knew the weapons would get into the hands of al-Qaeda, and that's why it had to be kept secret, because otherwise it would make it more difficult to, answer the fact that U.S. weapons are going right to al-Qaeda. So that was admitted, of course, after the fact.
And John Kirby at the Pentagon said that it would be unacceptable if U.S. arms had fallen into the hands of these neo-Nazis. But just days before Kirby's statement, the State Department said that it didn't happen. Here's a State Department skeptical that U.S. weapons were used in alleged Belgorod uprising. This wasn't an uprising. These were not organizations that came from Belgorod. Actually, residents were terrified. One civilian was killed. Many were injured, and people were not happy about it there. The U.S. is skeptical, according to The Hill, that American provided military equipment to Ukraine was used in an outbreak of fighting, the State Department said Tuesday, adding that Washington does not encourage or enable Ukraine to strike inside of Russia. Matthew Miller is the State Department spokesman. And here's what he said that I love this quote. We don't have perfect clarity of the information. We're looking at the same fuzzy images on social media. So because the images,
funny. They have every inch of Ukraine covered under surveillance. The U.S. can see everything. That was made clear from these Pentagon leaks that the U.S. is tapping, Ukrainian officials, including Zelensky. They know exactly what's going on. Whenever something like this is inconvenient, it's unclear. We're just looking at social media. We don't know. Yeah, it doesn't pass the laugh test.
Yeah, fuzzy images. Well, if you're watching this, just look up the images right now. They're not very fuzzy. They're all over mainstream media. So this is like the most pathetic attempt at skirting the fact that the U.S. has been not just supplying, but training neo-Nazis. There are plentiful photos of U.S. and Canadian officers inside NATO training bases going back to 2017 with leadership of the Azov battalion. But of course, now they're not Nazis anymore. They're defenders. So this is the more disturbing aspect, I thought, of Matthew Miller's comments. He said, while we don't encourage or enable attacks outside Ukraine's borders, we'll leave it to our Ukrainian partners on how to conduct this war. So basically, we don't stop them either from attacking inside Russia, these neo-Nazis. And that's the same thing that Tony Blinken said when asked, I think it was by David Ignatius on Press Freedom Day, about the Kremlin, the attempt to assassinate Vladimir Putin with a drone attack on the Kremlin. So this is the kind of rhetoric we're getting from the official spokesperson of the State Department after a neo-Nazi raid, cross-border raid, sponsored by Ukraine's government.
And just going back to what you mentioned, this was the Grayzone back in 2018. The U.S. is arming and assisting neo-Nazis in Ukraine while Congress debates prohibition. So, and that
you can see in some of those photos, well, that's a U.S. rocket launcher. It's a U.S. rocket launcher. It's like the PSIL-1. But you can see if you just stop it right there. I mean, these are, circled. You can see the Azov flag here and the U.S. flag. This is a U.S. officer. And Denis Prokopenko, who is the official military head of the Azov battalion, the person who was put in place of Andrei Beletsky until Beletsky returned recently. Prokopenko was a part of that training session with U.S. and Canadian officers.
Beletsky was recently quoted in the New York Times as just some military person. Didn't even mention that he's a Nazi. He's just happens to be a Ukrainian military officer. Didn't mention who he actually is. I mean, just the normalization of neo-Nazis. No one has done it more than liberal media outlets like the Times. It's off the charts.
He's just a patriot, or he's a Ukrainian activist. Didn't they call him an activist?
I'll have to double check. That's yeah.
Well, I understand from the leader of the Russian Volunteer Corps who gave this press conference, Denis Nikitin, and he's not to be confused with the Patch, that he said to expect more cross-border raids. And this appears to be a tactic that it betrays desperation, along with all the terrorist attacks being carried out by dubious elements backed by the Ukrainian SBU inside Russia against writers and intellectuals who support the Russian war effort. It suggests there isn't a whole lot of progress on the battlefield.
Here, I found that quote about Beletsky. It's from the New York Times. It's really interesting. First of all, the word we got about Beletsky was that he was done. He left the Azov battalion. He wasn't involved anymore, and this was
Right.
presented as proof that they're no longer Nazis. And then we find out that he actually was leading the Azov in the fight in Bakhmut, right? So this guy's playing a operational role as a commander in this huge battle. So okay, so much for that cover story. But this is how now the Times describes Beletsky in its piece. Let me show it to you. This is a new one. They say this: the fight in Bakhmut is led by Beletsky, a former ultranationalist politician and founder of the Azov Regiment. No mention, of course, that these are Nazis. A group that was part of Ukraine's National Guard before the war and is now integrated into the country's military forces with little or no political bent.
He's a former ultranationalist. It's like, he's reformed now. He's apologized. He's gone to Ibrahim X. Kendi racial sensitivity workshops. He's done the privilege walk, and now he's a former ultranationalist.
Former ultranationalist, yeah. Former ultranationalist, just like yeah. No need to say anything more. And now there's no more political bent at all. Nothing more to see here.
This
So
is the
move
guy
along.
who said
That's
that the
fine.
goal of Azov was to, the mission of Azov was to destroy the Semite-led Untermenschen and lead
Yes.
the white Christian races
Yeah.
to victory. This is
He snapped out of it. He snapped out of it. It's former. Doesn't feel that way anymore.